Well, it's been over a month since I've been here in front of this microphone, and we've got a new and improved Nothing But the Truth for 2022. I hate to sound like a laundry detergent, but really what's happened here is kind of a rethinking, rebranding, repairing, but expanding of Nothing But the Truth into things that more people will find interesting. I think that we're going to talk more about actual homicide investigation, murder cases, police procedural. We're going to go beyond just private investigation. All right, have I confused you? Good. Stick around, and we're going to talk about how all this began. So if you were watching a documentary on Netflix or something, and this music came on and you had the closed caption on the bottom of the screen, it would say pensive and enigmatic music, right? Or something like that. Or it might just say documentary, which is the name of this clip. Hey, Ramesh Nyberg. I'm the host of Nothing But the Truth. This is the podcast about real investigators and the world of real investigations. I'm glad you're with me. It is a new era for this podcast. I've been thinking about rebranding it or kind of retooling it for a while now. And I think the main reason why I wanted to do so was that we have been really focusing mostly on private investigation here. And I felt that even though I was doing a service to private investigators and I was getting good feedback, there was definitely a limitation. There was definitely a ceiling, not just a ceiling, but there were some walls too. And the more episodes I did, the more I felt those walls might be closing in just a little bit. I wanted to expand. Every time I talk to people about my career, they're really interested in the murder investigation aspect of it. They're interested in how real homicide squads on police departments work, because not many people really know how that works. If you've watched these shows, The Wire and all these other shows, there's some good ones out there, you still don't know how it really works. And I want to kind of bring that to life to you. In the coming podcast episodes throughout this year, we're still going to talk about private investigations. We're still going to try and impart some tools and techniques and strategies that you can use as an investigator, whether you're a police investigator or a private investigator. So I'm not giving up on that. What I do want to do is appeal to a wider audience, and I'm just being bluntly honest here. And I want to be able to cover more territory when it comes to the world of investigations. I did a lot in my 27 years as a homicide investigator and as a uniformed police officer, field training officer, surveillance squad, bunch of different things that I did. And I feel that there's a lot to be passed along. So how did it all start? And I want to kind of go back a couple of days. Today is January 9th is the day that I'm actually recording this. 2 days ago, a very famous actor named Sidney Poitier passed away at the age of 94. I bring him up because that is kind of where it all began for me. Those of you who are familiar with Hollywood and actors have seen Poitier back in his roles back in the 60s, 70s, and even some limited roles, I think, in the 80s. I don't know. I kind of stopped following his career after those early films that he became so famous for. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and To Serve with Love, and of course, In the Heat of the Night. Now, that movie that I just mentioned was one that had a profound impact on me. My parents sat me down in 1967. I was all of 9 years old, and we watched that movie together. And that was the first time that I'd really ever seen a police detective on television, like a real police detective. Now, we had Dragnet, we had Adam 12 and other police shows back then, but the setting in this movie and the plot was something very special and unique. Of course, it took place in the racism-infused South of the 1960s era. The civil rights movement hadn't really taken hold in the South. That's putting it quite mildly. And here was this incredible story of a police detective who was passing through a small southern town. The police detective is from Philadelphia. He's a homicide expert. And this little town has a murder that they don't know what to do with because they just don't have the resources and the skill and the knowledge and the background to do a proper investigation on a case of this magnitude. And here's this suspect they bring in, not knowing he's a cop, turns out he's this homicide guy from Philadelphia. And there's all this conflict going on the sheriff's side because he sees that this detective can be a valuable resource to him. And, of course, the detective himself, played by Poitier, who's a black man who just simply wants to get home to Philadelphia. But his professionalism takes over. He can't help himself, and he stays. And he helps them solve the murder. If you haven't seen this movie, I would highly recommend it to anyone. And the reason I go on and on about it is decades later is when I realized how influential that movie was on my life. People ask me, why did you become a police officer? What motivated you to go there? And a lot of times it's hard to answer. But when I look back, every time I see this movie, I go, yep, there's part of it. There's the nucleus of that started to grow in me as a young kid. I wanted to be like Detective Virgil Tibbs. I wanted to right wrongs, and I wanted to show people that professionalism and excellence can overcome racism and racial differences. So, as idealistic as that might sound, I think it was a powerful message. I think it was a fantastic movie. The acting was just absolutely superb. I mean, Rod Steiger, who played the sheriff, got Best Actor. The film got Best Film for 1967, Best Movie. So anyway, that's really what motivated me, one of the things that motivated me and probably steered me towards homicide investigation, probably subconsciously, as I worked my way through my first years in law enforcement where I was in uniform. But I had this thing that I just had to get to homicide. That's where I wanted to be. So thank you, Sidney Poitier. Thank you, Virgil Tibbs. Rest in peace, sir. And here we are, many, many years later with this podcast where I try and help investigators be the very, very best they can. I'm not the expert. I'm not the greatest detective in the world, but I worked with some fantastic investigators, some of whom I believe were the best in the world. When I started in police work, it was 1979. I was working in a small town called Opelika. If you've listened to the first couple of episodes of this podcast, you might have heard this before. So I'm just going to kind of gloss over it. I spent my first 6 years in uniform, as I said, and then once I got an opportunity to get to Homicide, I went. Homicide had this mystique to it. It was this place that all the other police officers in the department kind of looked at and thought they're the elite guys. Those are the guys who maybe have their heads in the clouds a little bit and wear ties. Nobody else wore ties to work. We did. People were in awe of us, but we were also very misunderstood. People also believed that we made more money than regular police officers. We did, but we didn't have a different pay scale. We were the same pay scale as a uniformed police officer working in patrol. We just made more overtime. What that also meant was we stayed away from home a lot, too. We got called out from home a lot to work on cases. So that money that we made was hard-earned money, and there was a price to pay for it, I assure you. When I started in Homicide, they asked me, what are your skills? What are your strong suits? And I said, well, report writing. I'm a great report writer. And I was a pretty good report writer in uniform. Writing reports in Homicide was an entirely different ballgame, and I had to relearn it. My not-so-little ego got slightly bruised when I got reports kicked back to me with red markings all over them saying, redo this part. What does this part mean? You need to explain this better. And I learned, like everybody else, I learned the ropes the hard way. Kind of like this podcast. When I started this whole endeavor, I had no idea how to do a podcast. I kind of learned it on my own. So I'm going to look at the first several episodes. What did I do? 19 or 20 of those before this one. A lot of those came back to my mind with red markings on them saying you can do better and you can reach more people. So here we are. And speaking of reaching more people, before I forget, I'd like to take a moment to shout out to some of my new listeners, specifically some of my students at Coral Reef Senior High School. The other day, a couple of my students came over to me. A few of my students came over to me and said, Mr. Nyberg, we found your podcast. And I was, delighted to hear that they were interested in listening to sometimes what they had already heard in class. So Coral Reef kudos, glad you're here. They also found out about my book, which is a small work that I did last year called The 10 Must-Haves to Be a Great Detective. Now, in no way does it imply that I am a great detective. I have just been around enough detectives and done enough of that kind of work to tell you how to become one. The rest is up to you. It involves a lot of hard work and focus and determination. So the 10 must-haves to be a great detective. It's available on Amazon as an e-Kindle book, or you can order it in paperback. So please check that out. It's 10 bite-sized, easy-to-read chapters. By no means a complete encyclopedia on everything you need to know. That's almost an impossible thing to prepare, but it's a kickstart, and I hope you'll take a look. I'm working on my second and third books already. One of them is about cold case investigations. So as that progresses, I'll tell you more about that later. Death investigations. It's a fascinating field. I learned so much in my 22 years as a homicide investigator, primarily about people. This is a people job. Those crime scene techs that we had working with us side by side on those scenes were some of the best, hardest working people you'll ever want to meet. We detectives were not the forensic experts. We knew what we wanted. We knew what we wanted to find out. And the crime scene investigators would go and get it for us. You know, they were like our bird dogs. We would see a hole in the wall and say, does that look like a bullet hole? Yeah, well, I need that projectile wherever it is. And man, they would get their tools out and start digging until they went into the studs behind the drywall and dug that projectile out of there. And I'm telling you, these guys were absolutely indispensable. We could not have closed the cases that we did without their hard work. So another shout out to the crime scene investigators, the crime scene techs, as we call them, of Miami-Dade Police Department. I love you guys. You were the best. We did the rest of the investigation when it came to piecing together what we found on the crime scenes, going to the autopsies, talking to the medical examiner, talking to witnesses over and over and over again, and hopefully eventually sitting down with a suspect in the interview room. If you came into homicide as someone who maybe was lacking in understanding human behavior, you got a crash course in it, in every single case you went on, whether that was a suicide, accidental death, natural death, or a homicide, and we handled them all. It was one of the most challenging jobs that I can ever think of. It was a job where you went to work every morning and walked in that homicide office, and you had no idea what was coming your way that day. Oh, you might have a bunch of things on your legal pad, some things that your to-do list, interview this witness, follow up with this information, handle these leads that are pending on this particular case, go to the autopsy. Maybe you had a meeting with a prosecutor, and it could all get wiped out in 1 minute when your sergeant came by and handed you a slip of paper that said, hey, there's a suicide up in the North End. You're up. Go handle that. And your day could change that quickly. So you had to be very adaptable. You had to be very much in the who moved my cheese thing. Okay, I remember that book coming out and it having a huge impact on the business community. That's the way police work was. Your cheese was going to get moved at any time without prior notice, maybe sometimes in an unfair way, but you had to deal with it. You had to adapt to it. The other thing that was sort of our philosophy about talking to people, and that is Goya Cod, Goyakod. It was mounted above our door in wooden letters, and it stands for get off your ass and knock on doors. You don't solve homicides or any type of crime by just sitting at a desk and making phone calls. You have to go out and you have to talk to people. You have to knock on doors. You have to follow up with information. This was often exhausting work, but it was also very fulfilling work when you finally put the cuffs on an offender and was able to put together a case, bring it to the state attorney's office for prosecution, and hopefully one day down the road hear a guilty verdict come back from the mouths of the jury. There's nothing like that. I handled many cases as a lead investigator. I assisted in hundreds of cases with other detectives. That's what we did. We helped each other. We worked on teams. And I went to cold case at the end of my career and worked a lot of old cases. Took cases kind of out of the doldrums, dusted them off, worked them, and searched for witnesses that had long since moved away, found them, and successfully closed some of those too. That was a different type of job that we did in cold case. So we're going to talk about all of that here on Nothing But the Truth. I'm going to open up those case files for you and walk through those lead sheets with you and show you what we did, how we did it, why we did it, and the things that were really different about what you may know of police work from Hollywood and how things were really done And I'm just going to start off with one story that might give you a little bit of insight into how and why we did things. We worked these cases because we wanted to help these families. These cases were about the next of kin, the ones that were left behind, the ones who had to hear the bad news from us when we knocked on the door and told them that their father or son or sister or daughter had been killed. We sat there through their grief, through their emotion, through their frustration while they were waiting for trial, and we were kind of holding their hand the whole way. That's what that was about. It was also about our level of professionalism. We felt like we were given one of the most difficult and important tasks there is in law enforcement, and that's to investigate the death of a human being and do our part for the victims' families so that they can hopefully experience whatever they conceive to be justice. Sometimes our cases would involve decomposed bodies. It wasn't unusual. A body's dumped somewhere out in a field or in the trunk of a car or maybe just undiscovered in an apartment for many days. The body would be bloated, smell horrible, have maggots crawling all over it. Part of our job was to return the jewelry that was on that body to the families. We were the ones that had to take off the earrings, the necklaces, the piercings, yes, wherever those piercings might be, the rings, and return them to the families before the body was transported to the morgue. You take all that stuff off the body and it's got this foul-smelling liquids, sometimes body tissue and skin stuck to it. And I hope you're not having breakfast when I'm explaining this to you. But there was no way in the world that we were going to return that nasty stuff to the family in that condition. What do you think we did? Do you think we had some people that we could hand it off to and tell them to go clean it up? Nope, that was the job of the homicide investigators. And it was not unusual to walk into the men's room on a given afternoon where there's been a few homicides and see detectives standing at the sink wearing gloves, scrubbing jewelry with toothbrushes, washing it with soap carefully, getting all the nasty stuff out of the crevices of the gold, silver, whatever it was we were washing. We washed the jewelry of these dead people so that we could give this jewelry back in relatively clean condition. That's right, we were jewelry washers. That was part of our job. You'll never see that on television, I guarantee you. All right, well, next time we'll get into a couple of cases that I think you'll enjoy, some cases that surprised us, gave us a lot of hard work to do. And I always ask for your feedback, positive, negative, or otherwise. Questions are always welcome. You can contact me through Facebook on our Facebook page, Nothing But the Truth Podcast, or you can send me an email, truth@nybergpi.com, truth@nybergpi.com. Thanks so much for being here for this new version of Nothing But the Truth. I hope you're going to like it. I know I already do. Take care, and remember, always put your best foot forward, but don't forget to work on your other foot. We'll see you next time.